Welcome, teams. How these interdisciplinary teams will operate on short intervals is an approach within Scrumban that's called working within a sprint. Now, a sprint is just a fancy name for a short interval of work in which you experiment, discover stuff, and adapt to what you've discovered. And so this really comes from the framework of Scrum. The software engineers will get to learn some of the more inner workings of Scrum, but mostly it focuses on that incremental development and focuses on what empirical results the team finds to drive future development. And there's activities that I'm not going to go over in this video that are specific only to the developers. But while developers are doing some of these Scrum meetings, the other teammates who are on the team will be part of the feedback process in reviewing and helping to plan what's going to be accomplished over a sprint. Now, during a sprint, the software engineering team will be designing, building, and testing some working functionality, and along the way, we'll discover some challenges that will need to be brought up with the whole team. Meanwhile, the other teammates will be learning about the market and really be the advocates for the customer. So they really need to learn a lot about the customer and the business needs. Gather that feedback from customers and other stakeholders and help drive strategic decisions for each of these short intervals of work. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to start off with 2-week intervals for our sprints. And so at the beginning of each of these sprints, we have an activity called sprint planning. And so sprint planning, the main focus is to, as an entire team, identify what's the most valuable functionality that can be developed with the least amount of effort. That is so that you can then deliver that functionality and get feedback from your customers or other stakeholders and adapt where necessary. At the end of that 2-week interval, we'll do what's called a sprint review. This is where the Scrum team, again, that's just the developers, but the Scrum team will demonstrate only the working features that they've been able to develop, and the team will compare what progress was planned versus what was actually achieved, so that for the following sprint, for the next 2 weeks, make adjustments where necessary. And so at the very beginning of each of the sprint, we'll start off with a planning session, including everybody. The different roles within that time period will diverge, where individuals work on their personal responsibilities and their part of the team's responsibilities, but then converge again for the review to see what was actually accomplished, what new things were found, and how the team can adapt as necessary. Now, some common challenges that we'll face along the way are how to strategically prioritize features to make sure that you're getting the most value out of the least amount of effort. Being able to define what is done. People sometimes define features in too broad of terms to have a common understanding of what will be offered when things are done. Predicting the amount of time and effort that needs to go into developing is notoriously hard within software applications. However, we'll take some strategies that help us along the way. And also, since people are coming from different disciplines, we'll learn some ways to help improve more effective communication to help the teams focus on what they need to and adjust challenges to when they arise. But first, let's talk about identifying what features need to be incorporated in your application. And in order to do so, we're going to write what are called user stories. And user stories are written in the perspective of the customer in this format. As a, then defining the role of the customer. I want to, then defining what that customer's goal is. And then as an optional point where you could add some more context, you can also define their motivation for that goal. Now, this describes the value from the customer's perspective, not from necessarily the business or the developer's perspectives. And so this really keeps the customer as the focal point of development. So for example, if we were developing Twitter from scratch, you might write a user story that says, as a content creator, I want to share a brief thought or observation with the world. Or, as a reader of that content, I want to identify that I like a tweet so that the author gets that feedback or gets that support. Similarly, there might be another user story that says, as a content creator, I want to reply to a tweet in order to engage in a global conversation. Now, each of these different user stories gets a perspective of what the user wants to be able to accomplish with that product. However, with those user stories, there should be a focus on what the user wants to accomplish, but not necessarily how they want to accomplish it. That would be getting into too much detail, and sometimes the customer doesn't know how to describe that concisely. One of the main focus points of user stories is it should be using terminology that can be understood by everyone. That means a developer, an entrepreneur, a user experience designer, a customer. They should all be able to read a user story and have somewhat of a common understanding of what it's describing. A user story also needs to be specific enough so that a team can have that common understanding of what that requirement means for that story to be done. Now, sometimes when you're not quite specific enough, you write what's called an epic user story. And epic user stories would be on broader terms that then need to be decomposed down into smaller stories. Now, developers, especially with some software engineering background, should have some aptitude at taking large problems and breaking them down into small parts. But this can be part of the conversation that they can help describe how a large overarching goal might be broken down into smaller features. However, even once you've defined all of those features, there's the task of what feature needs to be built first. And so what we'll be doing is building a product backlog. And that is really just a collection of all of these different user stories that the team has come up with. And so within that backlog, more stories can be added as either entrepreneurs or as the software engineers discover more stuff about the market. And then so this product backlog takes a central role in planning how you're going to go about accomplishing a sprint. So within those 2 weeks of a sprint, at the very beginning, you need to plan out what you're going to do. And so developers are going to go through the different user stories and assign points to them according to the proportional cost that they're going to expend trying to develop that particular user story. That includes how many people might be involved in developing that feature, if there's any additional technologies that need to be purchased or any other costs like that, as well as the amount of difficulty, how much time is going to be expended trying to develop that feature. But in sprint planning, you also need to have the discussion of which of those user stories adds the most value for the least effort. So you're not going to try to accomplish all of those stories during one sprint. You're going to identify which ones are the most valuable for the least effort, and then identify those as the user stories that you're going to focus on for the current sprint. Now, the second half of Scrumban comes from Kanban, which is a just-in-time engineering scheduling system to help you manage your progress. And so within a Kanban board, you have a list of what you're currently planning to do what is currently being done, actively worked on by one of the developers, or what has already been accomplished, or what falls in that done bucket. So you want to keep that Kanban board up to date in real time. As soon as you start an activity, it's moved into doing. As soon as it's completed, it's moved into done. And everybody has access to that Kanban board, so they'll have access and can monitor how that sprint is progressing. And similarly, at the end of a sprint, we're going to use that Kanban board as a discussion point to review both what was accomplished and what was not accomplished that had been planned to be accomplished. So the Scrum team's product owner will drive that conversation. And after the team has discussed what is done and what is not done, that can lead to discussions about how the pace is going, any adaptations that need to be happening within the team, but also guiding the planning for the following sprint so they can then prioritize what's been discovered during this last 2 weeks, both from the development standpoint, but also from the business standpoint, and figure out, again, what is the most value for the least amount of effort for the following sprint.